This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 865 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's mailbag questions, I want to send another reminder about the Late Round Prospect Guide. The guide will be dropping in just a couple of weeks, so make sure you take advantage of the pre-order price. It's currently $11.99. It'll go up to $14.99 on March 11th. The guide gives you everything you need to dominate your rookie drafts. You get information on my prospect models, you get prospect profiles, prospect scores, profiles for year 2 players, and so much more. It's almost 150 pages of content. You can pre-order now by heading to lateround.com. The first question this week is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, I was curious as to how the top-ranked prospects perform throughout their career relative to their dynasty rookie draft ADP. Looking at each top positional rookie from the past 11 years, highest drafted quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and rookie draft ADP, I was very surprised at the results. Turns out the highest correlation was at running back, at which 6 of the 11 running backs reached RB6 or higher in at least one season, and 10 out of 11 hit a top 24 season. Tight end was all right too, with 9 out of 11 having a top 12 season, but only 1 out of 11 had a top 3 season. Quarterback was hit or miss, with 6 out of 11 having a top 12 season. The biggest surprise of all, though, was wide receivers. Only 2 of the top-ranked wide receiver prospects since 2013, according to Dynasty ADP at least, ever had at least one top 12 wide receiver season, and 5 never even reached the top 36. With all this information, what do you think we should do with highly rated rookie wide receivers? It seems foolish to fade great prospects simply because of history. But with such a low hit rate, it makes me hesitate more on a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., because for as great as he might be, the past number 1 wide receiver prospects also include N'Keal Harry, Corey Davis, Corey Coleman, and Tavon Austin. Is it smarter to trade back and just take more chances on later round wide receiver picks and rookie drafts as opposed to trading up for a high-end wide receiver? Thanks as always. Can't wait to hear what you have to say about all of this mess. Jacob. So I don't think these results are all that shocking. Let me explain why. The first thing to note with something like this is that sample sizes aren't very big. We're only analyzing 11 running backs and 11 wide receivers here, and I'll keep things simple and just answer by focusing on those 2 positions. But 11 players isn't that many players. Funky things can happen. But even still, I don't think the results are that crazy. And it goes back to something that I've talked about a lot on this show. Running back talent, it matters in that we want our running backs to carve out roles for themselves. And hopefully a running back does that through talent. If he's good, a coach puts him on the field. He starts to see more volume. When he sees more volume, he scores more fantasy points. When you're talking about the top running backs in a given class by ADP, you're generally talking about round 1 running backs. Guys who were drafted in the first round, or at least the early second round, right? From 2013 to 2023, which is what you're dating this back to, 8 of the 11 drafts that you're looking at had a first-round running back selection. And I would assume that the vast majority of rookie drafts then saw those running backs as the RB1 in their class. Well, when a running back gets drafted in the first round, he's almost guaranteed some production. It's extremely rare for a first-round running back, especially in today's NFL, to not get production over the first couple of years of his career. He usually sees a lot of work right away. Because at the end of the day, a coach can simply say, this guy's talented, I'm going to put him on the field. Even if he's not that talented, like let's just say Najee Harris, then that player can still be fantasy relevant. Essentially, a first-round running back is telling us that a coach is more likely going to give him volume. Whether that's true or not, that's the correlation, right? That's not the case at wide receiver. Wide receivers need to get open. They need to be good in order to see the rock. The talent profile, it needs to be there more than it does at running back. And that can cause some natural volatility. Because instead of it being pretty obvious as to which players are going to get volume like it is at running back, it becomes slightly less obvious. Now, not only that, but wide receiver, it's a more competitive position in fantasy football. You're comparing top 24, top 12, top 3 seasons. But there are more wide receivers competing for those spots than there are at running back. And if we're basically only talking about first-round running backs here, or mostly first-round running backs, then we know that they're going to be high in carries and targets compared to the rest of the league. Let me put it this way. There are 32 teams in the NFL. All of them have a backfield, and all of them have some group of wide receivers. If a running back gets drafted in the first round, he'll have a very high likelihood of owning his backfield. There are only 32 backfields in the league, and many of those backfields don't have a single running back owning it the way that a first-round running back would. So that means that a first-round running back, or one picked very highly, he's likely to come through and perform well relative to his position. Now look at wide receiver. Not only will it take a minute for a wide receiver to post numbers, like you have 2022 and 2023 data in here, which includes Drake London and Jaxon Smith-Njigba. That's probably not fair. But it's just not as easy for these wide receivers to see that production. So let's just look at how actionable all of this is. That's really what matters here. I do think that what this means is that we should rank first-round running backs generally ahead of most wide receivers. I say most because every once in a while, you're going to get a Jamar Chase level prospect where there can't miss. In that case, it's totally reasonable to put a wide receiver like Jamar Chase over a running back if you want, even if that running back went in the first round. But here's the thing, I think we're already generally doing this. Last season, I had Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs ranked ahead of Jaxon Smith-Njigba because first-round running backs are just generally very good and safe investments. Now, if you want to shift your focus to this year's draft class, I wouldn't approach things this way. I wouldn't just take the RB1 in this year's draft class and rank him ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors. I don't think that you can blanket this approach across all rookie drafts. Objectively, we have at least one blue chip wide receiver prospect in this class in Marvin Harrison Jr. I think there's multiple because Malik Neighbors looks really good too. And this year's running back class is really not that good at the top, like I said on the show earlier this week. There's even a chance that we don't have a consensus RB1 once the draft is over. So what I think you've realized with this exercise, as imperfect as it is given the sample sizes and such, and look, there's a lot of variance involved with something like this. But what you realized more than anything isn't so much that wide receiver is terrible. Yes, the top wide receivers haven't been great over the last 11 years, but there's noise to something like that. What you realized more so, in my opinion, is the safety of a top running back, of a first-round running back. Those guys dominate, and they should always be considered over wide receivers. We just don't have that kind of back in the 2024 class. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @KyleMorrisKC. It says, how does your breakout score look at a guy like Cody Schrader? He put up big numbers at D2 Truman State before transferring to Missouri, before he kind of broke out again in the SEC. So if you didn't listen to the show earlier this week, pause this episode and go listen to it. I talked about this year's running back class. On the show, I mentioned my new metric called breakout score. Instead of looking at breakout age, which is a pretty binary metric, I'm using a score that helps determine how strong a player's breakout really was. At running back, that score is based on different yards per team play thresholds. At wide receiver, as you'll learn about next week, it's about yards per team pass attempt. Running back doesn't adjust based on program strength. So someone who went to Alabama, he'll be scored the same way as someone who went to Truman State. So Schrader, for example, has a higher breakout score because he played weaker competition, basically. That might seem unfair. And if I was only working off a breakout score, it would be unfair. But at running back, my guess is the reason the adjustments don't work as well in the model is because draft capital probably captures any small school production variance. In other words, we're not going to see a running back who played at Truman State for 4 years or someone like Isaiah Davis who went to South Dakota State. We're not going to see those players get drafted very high. And if they do get drafted high, then that's signaling to us that there's talent there. They'll look really good in the model. And if you go look at history at running back versus wide receiver, smaller school running backs end up performing better than smaller school wide receivers. And it probably has to do with the talent profiles and what I talked about with the last question. So Schrader, who's got a crazy collegiate journey, he had a total yards per team play rate in 2021 that was out of control at Truman State. He's a little bit older though, so his breakout score actually didn't end up being elite even with that huge season. They only played 4 games in 2020, and that's not enough games for a player's season to be eligible for a breakout score, and his numbers weren't strong enough in 2019. He's been around for a while. Basically, for smaller school players, there are other factors that would hypothetically mitigate an inflated breakout score. Like, for example, most smaller school players, most small school running backs, they're older. We're not going to see many small school running backs declare early for the NFL draft. And if they end up transferring like Schrader did, we usually won't see an immediate declaration for the draft from players like that either. So it all kind of works together. But to answer your question, Schrader's breakout score is indeed a top 5 breakout score in this year's class. But he also had a really good final season that would have given him some semblance of a breakout score too. And that final season was not at Truman State. This next question is from Twitter from @GoldenKnights. It says, just how bad was Jaxon Smith-Njigba's rookie year? His ADOT was garbage. Yards per catch was trash. Drop rate was sky high. He feels like a massive sell. So I would say the only concern with the stats that you mentioned was ADOT, of all of them. Because when an average depth of target is low, yards per catch is going to be naturally low too. Because he's catching passes closer to the line of scrimmage. It's why deep threats, or players with higher ADOTs, they have high yards per reception rates too. But let's talk about JSN. He did indeed have a really rough average depth of target. That's because the Seahawks gave him a ton of targets behind the line of scrimmage. According to PFF's data, JSN led all 30-plus target receivers last season in percentage of targets that came behind the line of scrimmage. I think if we take a step back and we look at this rationally, we can say that JSN's ADOT, it was so low, not necessarily because he was this pathetic wide receiver who can't play, but rather because they had guys like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the roster getting those higher ADOT looks. They were getting the looks down the field. And those two players only missed one game last year. But guess what? In that game, it was a game in week 7 against the Cardinals when DK Metcalf was out. JSN saw his highest target share, receiving yard total, and fantasy point total of the season. And he also played his fewest snaps out of the slot. Now, I'm not trying to sell this as you should buy JSN. I'm merely giving context to his numbers. He was in an objectively unique situation last year. I can sit here and say that wide receivers earn their playing time, which they do. But Seattle also played a style offensively that didn't always involve their slot receiver. That was ultimately the demise of JSN's rookie season. But even still, he still had a 17% target share. We can't discount his prospect score either. That's one thing that's really important to remember. Rookie season numbers alone, they're not as predictive as rookie season numbers alongside a player's prospect score. That's why my year 2 model exists in the first place. JSN in that model currently has a score of 92.6, which based on history tells me and us that he's not really a buy or a sell. He's more of a hold. And that's what I'd be doing if I had Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Unless you can get rid of him and get another higher end wideout from last year's class plus something extra. This next question is from Twitter. It says, "Hi JJ, I enjoyed the running back prospect episode. Thanks. Can you provide some historical context for your ZAP rankings? Like who in the last few draft classes scored in the 80s and 90s? And how does this class compare to the one with Damian Harris a few years ago?" So in terms of how this class compares to the one with Damian Harris a few years ago, which was 2019, I'd say this one has a chance to be deeper. But that one also had Josh Jacobs. I don't know why we're talking about it being Damian Harris's class. It was Josh Jacobs' class. There are no Josh Jacobs level prospects in this year's class. So it just depends on how you look at things. It might be deeper, but there's not high-end talent. But just to reiterate some of the things that I've said on the show this week, I revamped my prospect models this offseason, and I named them the ZAP model. Now, in the prospect guide, there's a table that's going to show you historical results of the model. Not the individual players, but the probability of players hitting certain points per game thresholds in fantasy at different ZAP score levels. But to answer your question directly, let's just look at the last 3 draft classes. So 2021, 2022, and 2023. There were 8 running backs with scores over 90 during this time period. And this is in order. Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Najee Harris, and Javonte Williams all received scores over 95. And they were ranked in that order, like I said. And then Kenneth Walker was next, and then Zach Charbonnet actually got in there too. Next on the list is guys in the 80s, and again, this is in order. The next player is Devon Achane, then Rachaad White, then Tank Bigsby, and then James Cook. Tajay Spears was just outside 80. So the big miss of this group, definitely Tank Bigsby. But it's done a pretty good job in recent history. And remember, for last year's class, you can read about their profiles in the year 2 model section of the prospect guide. I think some of you will get a lot from that portion of the guide. The last question this week is an email from Sean, and it's about this year's wide receiver draft class. It says, "Hey JJ, I'm curious to know which wide receivers you're nervous about from this year's class. People are saying it's an awesome class, but are there any at the top you might be fading?" So I'll be doing my wide receiver primer next week. It'll be just like the running back one that you heard earlier this week. I'm profiling all 39 wideouts who will be at this year's combine in the prospect guide. So far, I've profiled all the higher end players. All that's left is digging into the later round guys, which honestly is the most fun for me because I think that's where rookie drafts are won. But one wideout I just can't understand the hype for, one of two, I'm going to talk about two of them here, is A.D. Mitchell out of Texas. I prospect through data, as we all know. And one of the main metrics used in the ZAP model is receiving yards per team pass attempt. It drives breakout score. And Mitchell's best season in yards per team pass attempt is bottom 5 in the class. And then on top of that, he has the worst best season yards per route run rate too. It's very rare for wide receivers to succeed with numbers that poor. He's currently projected to go in round 2. And since 2011, here's a list of wide receivers from round 2 who had a yards per team pass attempt in their best season as low as Mitchell's. Aaron Dobson, Mecole Hardman, and Van Jefferson. Expand that to top 100 players, and you add TJ Graham, Marquise Goodwin, Braxton Miller, Josh Palmer, and Terry McLaurin. And Terry McLaurin is dubbed as an outlier every single season when people talk about his prospect profile. Now, I understand that there are traits and some competition-related factors that favor Mitchell. Some of that's actually still captured in his overall score in the ZAP model. His score is currently 82.9 in that model, which gives him a higher risk profile. If he gets selected in rookie drafts where his draft capital suggests, I'm probably going to be out. I actually don't think he's the best wide receiver coming out of Texas. I think Xavier Worthy is. And then another wide receiver who I'm probably going to be a little bit lower on the consensus, at least that's what it looks like right now, it's Keon Coleman. His production numbers really aren't that strong, and his statistical comps are absolutely brutal. His top one is Brashad Perriman, and then Cordero Patterson and Kelvin Benjamin also pop up. So if he ends up being like the wide receiver 4 or the wide receiver 5 in this class, I'm probably going to be out. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.